Hello and welcome to Long Beach Lens. I am your host, Derek J. Simpson, Executive Director of the Long Beach Community Action Partnership. Today we will be speaking with a civil rights activist, a community poet, and a public health advocate, and I must say also a dear friend. Please help me in welcoming Miss Peggy Trotter Damon Preacely. How are you, Peggy?
I'm fine, thanks, Derek.
It's been a while since we've talked and seen each other. And as I was doing my homework for this particular interview, I must say I learned a lot about you that I didn't know.
Really?
And the more I read, the more I thought, wow, what was I missing all that time? Because we were so immersed in the work of the community and doing what we did, working together. But your work started long ago in terms of the community at the age of 15 when you began working in the civil rights movement. Can you begin by sharing what prompted that and what that was like at such a young age?
Sure. I grew up in Harlem, New York. I was born in Pittsburgh, and I was raised by parents that always felt that we should have service to our community and to uplift ourselves and help others. So when 1955 came and the killing of Emmett Till and all of the lynchings and things that were going on in the South, those of us that were living in the North, we felt we had to do something. So we started picketing Woolworths, and we started being in support of what some of the activities were in the South. And my family was also a reason why I became an early activist. My great-great-grandmother and grandfather were escaped slaves from Macon, Georgia in 1848, and they escaped on the Underground Railroad. Okay. And my great-uncle, William Monroe Trotter, in 1906 founded a liberation newspaper in Boston and actually chained himself to the theater to protest Birth of a Nation, D.W. Griffith's film.
Yeah.
So I guess you would say it was in my blood to be a part of the protest movement.
Really? So quickly then, when you go back to the Underground Railroad, for instance, I was just back in my hometown of Mobile, Alabama, and I was at the red light, and when I looked over to the side, there was a plaque on a little wall saying that was the last slave market, and that was where the slave ship Clotilda landed, which was the last slave ship to come into the United States.
Oh, I didn't know the last one.
Yeah, it was on a bet that the captain could get around the security and take one last load of slaves. So how did you find out that history about your family from the Underground Railroad? Because I know, unless it's an oral history for many families, it's often not captured. I can't go back far, for instance, in my own family. How did you get that?
That's a good question, because it really did make a difference that once William and Ellen escaped from Macon, Georgia, they went through Philadelphia and to Boston. And then in 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, so the slave catchers came after them to Boston. And at that point, they had barely learned to read and write. They were house slaves. One was a carpenter, and my great-grandmother was sold as a wedding present to the daughter of her father, because my great-great-great-grandmother was from Mali, and she was then the daughter was the illegitimate daughter of the slave owner. So she didn't have to work in the fields, but she was a house servant, but they still were not allowed to read and write. So they were ferreted on the Underground Railroad all the way to Halifax, Nova Scotia, about 1850. And from there they went to England. And in England they became part of the abolitionist movement. So, and once they learned to read and write, they wrote their story down. And I have the book, which is called Running 1,000 Miles for Freedom by William Craft. So when I was about 7 years old, my mother, Ellen Craft Damon, who was named after my great-great-grandmother, began to read to my brother and myself the story of how our ancestors escaped. So I'm an oral historian, and I teach families.
I'm sitting here listening to you. It's like you got the dates and all the details.
Well, I just love to have families interview their elders so that they can learn their stories. And I was fortunate enough to be able to read that. In addition, William Grant Still's The Underground Railroad book was one of the first books that when I was 7 years old, my mother had me begin to read. And those are the collected stories of others who escaped on the Underground Railroad. So, you know, I just feel as if each person and each family has a story. We were just fortunate that ours was written down and that we could learn about it when we were so young.
Yeah, it's disappointing to me, again, making it personal, that I know that my great grandfather on my mom's side was a white Irish slave. People think about slavery, but they don't always think about there were different kinds of slaves that came here. So if we fast forward then from that time frame up into the 50s and the 60s, and then you find yourself doing a sit-in in North Carolina and Maryland. What was that like, and what inspired
I first
that?
became a freedom rider on the eastern shore of Maryland after I went to jail in 1961 in Cambridge, Maryland. We had a sit-in because we wanted to test that you know, black and white weren't allowed to sit together. And that was my first time in jail. And it was pretty scary and pretty powerful because we were fasting for 5 days. And when you fast, your mind kind of gets sort of loopy. But we decided that we would do that after we were arrested in Crisfield, Maryland. And many people don't know that the eastern shore of Maryland is one of the most racist places back in the 50s and 60s.
Wow.
Maryland itself has a long history. So we stayed 5 days in jail at Christmas. We got arrested Christmas Eve. So we spent Christmas in jail, and we won over our jailers because we sang freedom songs, and the jailers couldn't shut us up. And as the community came to sing underneath our jail cell to keep our spirits up, they would leave, and then about 1 o'clock in the morning, we would hear the jailers singing the freedom songs.
Oh, wow.
And so, as you know, nonviolence was about changing things from a nonviolent perspective. And in those days, this was the early days of the civil rights movement. It was very much a part of what we were taught by Reverend James Lawson and who followed Gandhi.
Right, and I noticed that in talking about the early days, there was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or
SNCC.
SNCC.
Yes.
And for those who don't know what SNCC is, explain.
In 1960, there were 4 men who sat in Greensboro, North Carolina, and out of that came the formation of many students from around the country. We gathered in Raleigh, North Carolina at Shaw University, and we founded SNCC. We were led by Ella Baker, the grand community organizer, and one of my dear friends and a leader. I knew her in Harlem and ran into her through SNCC. So SNCC was the young people's movement, kind of similar to Black Lives Matter today, in contrast to the SCLC, which was Dr. King's group. So we were the young radicals. We were the ones that you couldn't shut up and that told us, and we said, we want direct action and we want it now.
Now, there was another element, as you say that, I would imagine, and you can correct me here. Where did Malcolm X and his involvement, you talk about Dr. King and SNCC and everything else, did those paths ever cross or that philosophy?
Yes. Well, I used to listen to Malcolm on the street corner of 7th Avenue and 135th Street. Before he became a Muslim. And of course his incredible rhetoric and personality attracted us, and many of us listened to him and then later understood that he spoke in a more extreme way so that some of the things that Dr. King and other civil rights leaders would sound more acceptable. And Malcolm was a genius and also in his conversion when he began to say that he was interested in good people all over and not just black people. And I was living in Boston when he was assassinated at the Audubon Ballroom and had been there many times. So even though I did meet him and shook his hand, he was not a personal friend or colleague the way Dr. King was later for me.
Now, I was going to ask you that question because you talk about people like James Farmer and Ella Baker and Dr. King, and you attended, trainings with some.
Yes.
Can you share how you got to those and what came out of it?
Well, as I mentioned, Reverend James Lawson, who actually has been my pastor here in Los Angeles at Holman United Methodist Church, where I attend, He went to India and studied under Gandhi, and he came back and taught Dr. King the nonviolent activities that were followed by the Shanti Sena, which were the peace forces of the Indians that fought the British. And Reverend Lawson taught at Highlander Folk School in Tennessee, and that was a hotbed, you would say, of liberals, both black and white, in the 50s and the 60s. They also had been a part of the labor movement and working with the farmers. So I was privileged to go to those trainings, and in order to be in SNCC, you had to, in 1960, you had to agree to be nonviolent. So we had to be trained not to react when they spit on us or burned us or shouted or did any of the other things, because the movement, the early movement, and we can talk about what happened later too, was you had to make a commitment to nonviolence. So that's where we learned nonviolent training.
Do you find that, because I didn't know that tidbit about Dr. Lawson and how he introduced that concept to Dr. King.
Yes.
Do you find that that's generally known when that story is told, or is that a piece of the story that people need to be reminded of, in the sense of how the nonviolence movement got its roots?
Yeah, I think some people do know it, but I am sure that story really needs to be told.
Right.
Ava DuVernay's Selma touches on Dr. Lawson as one of the characters in the background there, but it presumes that Dr. King was already following nonviolence, and of course, as a pastor, he was. Right. But the actual techniques of nonviolence,
much more strategic in terms of what, and that's why I asked that question.
Yes,
because
he was the strategist, and you know, every month, Reverend Lawson teaches nonviolent workshop at our church here in Los Angeles.
Wow.
So for the CCJ, what was
CCEJ.
When I was in it, it was NCCJ, back in the 60s.
Right.
I know that working with young people today, we want to give them alternatives to violence. Yeah. And that's an excellent workshop for people to attend.
It's a powerful workshop. I'd love to be involved in how you make that come to life, because it is strategic.
Yes.
And it is something that people don't know inherently, but they may have the qualities to make it come to fruition if they just knew how to go about it. We're going to take a short break with this fascinating lady that's joined us, and when we come back, Peggy's going to actually do a poem that she's written that I think you'll find very interesting. We will continue our conversation with Peggy Trotter Damon Preacely. Stay tuned for more of Long Beach Lens.
Deborah, are you tired of coming home to an empty, lonely house? Why not try Animal Match Rescue Team? We are a small dog rescue group in Long Beach. AMRT is looking for loving homes and has a variety of small dogs to choose from. Just come to Petco, 6500 PCH, any weekend from 11 to 2 to see just a few of our little dogs. To find out how you could adopt, foster, volunteer, or donate, go to amrt.net. 100% of all proceeds go to our animals. Right, Pearl? You'll be glad you did.
Welcome back. I'm your host, Derek J. Simpson, and we've been having a conversation with Peggy Trotter Damon Preacely here on our program. And Peggy, you were telling me during the break of this particular poem and that you've written about Dr. Nelson Mandela, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to share just a piece of it so that people could hear just the depth of your thoughts on that particular subject.
Thank you. I would
Sure.
love to.
There you go.
I performed this poem at my church in 2013 when we were celebrating Dr. Mandela. For Mandela, our Madiba. We see him in our children who now have a mighty hope. We chant his name out loud now, never more to weep and moan. We see him in his people. They stood by him day and night. His courage and resistance taught us wrong does not make right. We saw him in the courtrooms. The legal system prevailed. Yet with his unflinching courage, all political conniving failed. His courage and determination made his jailers just pile on more, but his quiet strength abounded, his silence a mighty roar. He will always be our dear Mandiba. From God, he was ours on loan. He resides in our hearts and sinews, his words in our very bones.
Wow, beautiful, beautiful. And we have social media here, and I'll ask Malign, who is our social media specialist, to maybe get the word out. If you have that available, we can maybe share it with others so they can see just how beautiful those words are.
I actually work with young children, particularly in the continuation schools, teaching poetry as a way of communication. And I just love to write. I'm a writer, and I know you too, Derek, are a poet. Maybe we should do something together.
We should. We'd be an awesome team.
Yeah, because we want words, not bullets. You know?
Yeah, and I was going to ask you that because you're talking about Reverend Lawson, you're talking about Dr. King, you're talking about Ella Baker, and now Nelson Mandela. Many powerful people have touched your life, either directly or indirectly in terms of their inspiration. Do you see common threads beyond what is the obvious when you look at the character of those leaders that we've had in the past?
I do, and it's really Ella Baker's uplifting, and even our president, Obama, community organizing. It's something that, to me, is very sacred and is very necessary because when you become a community organizer, you become a part of your community. You say you care. Talking to young people, that's about voting, that's about finding their passion, doing something for themselves. And I see that as a thread in different ways. Individuals' way that we find that we serve may not always be the same way. Some people serve by caretaking their children and making sure that there's education. Others by standing on a picket line. But if you look at community organizing in the essence of what it is, that to me is where social change takes place.
It's interesting that you say that because just recently I attended a meeting about genocide in terms of downtown Long Beach. When you look at housing, because people are being moved out and displaced with the high-rise condos and apartments, but the average worker who's making that minimum wage can't afford to live there, and more they're being pushed out of the city. And I know that that's a big issue in cities like San Francisco as well, where the average working person just can't afford to live in that city. But the point was, as a community, collectively, we need to organize to say there is nothing about a landlord preparing your house to be a safe place to live. There's no protection for renters, so to speak. So I think on that, or issues like Proposition 47 or other things, it's really important.
We started out actually in the 50s sweeping the streets in Harlem because we wanted to engage people in direct activity, but first we wanted to be of service. And so in New York, there's stoops where people sit on the stoops, and we would go with our brooms and say, "Good afternoon. Would you like your stoop to be swept?" And then we would engage them in conversation. So I think I've been a community organizer a long time, and
a true servant leader too. When you think about that, you're not just sitting in a pulpit or on a dais someplace saying, "Hey, go do that and come back and tell me how it went." You're talking about rolling up your sleeves, being right there with the people.
Well, that's what was so important in going south. When I went south in 1962 to be a SNCC field worker in Southwest Georgia, it became second nature to me to sit on the porches and try to help people register to vote. We taught at night in the churches voter registration, and then they burned our churches down. But we met outside anyway, or in people's homes, and they would shoot through the homes where we were staying, and we'd sleep on the floor on mattresses. So SNCC became a sense for me of consummate community organizing. That's really where we felt Jim Farmer and James Foreman, and I just saw the film about John Lewis now called Get in the Way. It's a wonderful new film that I did an introduction with others for. And John Lewis is, of course, when we were kids, we were 15, 16 years old together, and now here he is a congressman and still serving. He's still serving.
Yes.
So many people who were early SNCC members continue to be active in their communities.
I want to go back and touch on that point about going down south, because I know it's called the 1964, the Mississippi Freedom Summer, and you were in the South prior to that. Can you talk about that linkage between what you were doing, which was some of what you just mentioned, I believe?
Well, what happened is Charles Sherrod and Charles Jones came to the North to recruit black and white students to be a part of the, prior to the Freedom Summer, to the 1962 Albany movement. So I was recruited to be a field secretary and do voter registration. And my best friend and I, Kathleen Collins, she's a filmmaker. Her film is now being shown around the United States. She unfortunately is deceased. We went to Southwest Georgia. We lived and worked with the individuals, and I think we made a difference. We were jailed 3 times, stockade, very scary, but that's what you did, you know. And I realize now at age 73 that the people who were really brave were the people that stayed after we left. They were the ones who risked their homes.
Live with it,
They were the ones who lost their jobs. They were the ones who were actually more in danger than us, because we could always go back to New York or Chicago or somewhere else. So I have great admiration for the black folks and the sharecroppers that really sacrificed.
Yeah, I know in my own hometown, I asked my father once, you know, did Dr. King ever come from Montgomery to Mobile, which, you know, is maybe 2 hours drive these days on the freeway. And he said, no, you know, they got together, the black community says, no, we're okay down here because, you know, because of those reasons. I mean, it was serious. My best friend growing up, his house was bombed just because his dad was an attorney that focused in that particular area. And I was too young to know all those dynamics because my whole world was black.
Well, what's interesting too is there's so many unrecognized heroes. You hear the icons, but the real heroes are the ones whose names. I lived with a lady named Mama Dolly Raines, who opened her home to us freedom students, SNCC workers, and she said, you all may be nonviolent, but I got my shotgun. And she would sit on the front porch with her shotgun across her and watch out for the night riders for us. She also cooked us squirrel for breakfast, which I'd never had before.
Yeah, I'm thinking I'll pass on that.
And then
that's when I would have went on a fast.
Then you would have went on a fast. But I also learned how to chop cotton, because in order for the folks to come to our Freedom School classes at night, we had to help them get their crops in by the day. So I was a New York person, but I was also an outdoors person. But I never felt anything like the Georgia sun.
It's oppressive for sure.
Yes.
We're going to be close on time soon, and I wanted to get to talk about fast forwarding to the Vietnam era, when you were even involved in that movement in terms of conscientious objectors. Tell us that story.
My brother was a conscientious objector, and I lived in Boston, and Boston is on the route to Canada. So at the time, my former husband and I ended up having Black Panthers living in the basement and draft evaders living in the attic, because we were opposed to that war. I was a part of the women's peace movement, and actually did some illegal things with the files of the recruiters. So I'm very proud of that, because it was an unjust war, and I was proud to stand against it at the time.
Now, Peggy, in this time that we have left, I have other questions I want to talk about today, right? Because all of that history doesn't mean anything if we're not cognizant of it today,
Yes.
and if we're not using it to apply in what the issues are of today. So when you think about the millennials, as they would call them, or us as a community, in the 2 minutes that they're telling me that we have left, what would be your thought, your words of wisdom to the community that's listening about community organizing, about getting involved and making our community a better place to live? What would you say to them?
I like this question.
Good.
And I promised myself I wouldn't do an interview again without a young person, but that wasn't possible because they're in school right now.
I'm young.
Okay, well, I have 9 grandchildren, and they're
not that
ranging
young.
in all kinds of ages. I even have a great-granddaughter. And the reason I like that question is because we found our passion in those days. And I say to young people today, and even people of any age, find your passion and do something about it. I continue to be active against human trafficking, and people may be interested in the environment. They may pick domestic abuse. They may pick housing for the homeless or low-income housing. It's important to find something to serve for, because that's what we did then. But look at today. Look at the violence and the internecine warfare between different ethnic groups. It pains my heart. But I do believe that I have hope. I do pray, and I do believe in service to the community, and I've met so many wonderful people because of that. So I say to people, find your passion and do something about it.
On that note, Peggy, I just want to thank you, and I want to invite you back another time, and we'll promise to have a teen here with us, or somebody to do that.
They ask hard questions.
They do, they do. They have no filter. Well, that concludes our show, but I do want to make a correction. Earlier I said genocide, and I meant to say gentrification, because that's something that we're concerned about, both here in Long Beach and in other cities. That concludes our show. I'd like to thank Peggy Trotter, Damon Preacely, for joining us today. Be sure to follow PadNet TV on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for the latest updates. This show has been brought to you with the support from the Long Beach Community Action Partnership. Thank you for watching Long Beach Lens.